Hello and welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be on the John F. Kennedy administration. The Kennedy family really has become one of these iconic American families. Now, the Constitution really forbids us from having American royalty, but the Kennedy family, because of their image, their wealth, and their position of influence within the government really is, kind of considered American royalty, if not officially, at least culturally. The Kennedy family, the patriarch of the Kennedy family is actually Joseph Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's father. Kennedy's father, made his money during the Prohibition era. He starts out kind of as a bootlegger distributing illegal alcohol. He takes that money and during the Great Depression, he invested in the stock market. He's very successful there, builds up a fortune, and has this really rather large family. The initially, and Joe Kennedy has a dream, and that dream very specifically is to one day make his son president. And so, he has several sons and he really is pinning all the hopes on the eldest son. Well, the eldest son goes to war during World War II and will die. He's a pilot and he gets killed during the war. And so, Joe, after his eldest son dies, really pins all of his hopes on the second son, which is John F. Kennedy. Now, John F. Kennedy wasn't originally picked by Joe Kennedy to be the kind of, the chosen one, very specifically because John, as a younger kid, was only an average student. Was kind of sickly. Eventually he's going to end up having back problems that he's going to have to be medicated for. With some real serious pain medication. Very good looking, very charming, but wasn't like the intellectual powerhouse that some of his other brothers were. And so, but the family is really going to kind of just kind of put John F. Kennedy and thrust him into a position of power. And what you're going to see is his entire life he ends up being groomed to become the president of the United States. He is, like you can see in the picture here, very good looking man, comes from wealth. He's going to go to all the best schools. He'll eventually get into Harvard. Now, when he gets into Harvard, like I said, he's not a great student. His dad is going to grease some wheels to be able to get him into Harvard. They're going to pay for all the best tutors. And what we know now is that a lot of those tutors were doing his homework for him and helping him in a way that we would consider cheating today. But they're going to eventually get him through Harvard, where he will then go on to join the Navy in World War II. In the Navy, he's going to be serving in the Pacific, and he's going to be a captain on a PT boat, those small little boats. That boat will very infamously be attacked and is going to sink. And John F. Kennedy and his crew are going to have to, swim to safety. And John F. Kennedy later is going to, write a book about this, PT 109, where, he, again, one of those things where, he comes back from the war. There are far greater stories of heroism during the war than what John F. Kennedy actually did. Not to say, his leadership when the boat went down, it was important. It saved a handful of lives. That's, that's valuable, and he should be applauded for that. But in the scheme of the entire war, this is a very small incident. That he didn't really see that much action. In comparison to what other people did, we really wouldn't call him a war hero, right? There are all kinds of no-name guys from farm in Kansas that did much more heroic things and did things that helped the war effort much better than what Kennedy did. But Kennedy and his family forever opportunists. When Kennedy gets back from the war, he's going to hire a ghostwriter. He's not going to write the book himself. A ghostwriter is when you hire somebody to like write the book for you. You dictate kind of what you want to say, and they actually write it. And that book will end up becoming, a bestseller and is really going to propel Kennedy's political career. It makes him, he comes from this wealthy family. He's a good-looking guy, and now he's got this book about his war exploits that are, going to really make him very popular. It's very similar to what Teddy Roosevelt did during the Spanish American War, right? I mean, Roosevelt walks away a hero from the Spanish American War, and he did heroic things. But he wasn't, like the linchpin that his book made him seem. Kennedy, his book kind of, is going to over exaggerate exactly what it is that he did. Now, more heroic than anything I've ever done. So, keep that in mind. But again, it's the beginning of building this myth of a man and this image that is going to be very important to the Kennedy family. He will eventually be elected to the Senate in 1953. He's kind of this rising star. He's super young, good looking, and kind of a moderate politician. He's a Democrat, but he is, he's got some things that appeal to everybody. He's going to be in favor of tax cuts. So he's like socially moderately liberal. He's going to make an appeal to the civil rights movement without being very committal. So he's going to appeal to African Americans without seeming leftist. But he's also going to appeal to conservatives because he's going to be in favor of economic conservatism. Even though he does believe in deficit spending, he still believes in tax cuts as well. And he's as a senator, he really just kind of views this as a stepping stone to the next office. As president, he is going to really be the president that's going to start the longest sustained period of growth in American history. And so, and again, I think that probably has something to do with, his moderate political philosophy. I'm always very critical about the president's role in the economy. I think most economists would tell you that, presidential policies are probably not that important when it comes to economic growth, except that their policies can create stability, and he's going to be relatively moderate. He's going to increase spending on, Social Security. He's going to have some, subsidized housing programs to try and help minorities. He's also going to cut taxes and be relatively pro-business. And so, that's going to help. The biggest thing is the spending on the military for the Cold War, and the fact that veterans, we've talked about in previous lectures, once you get in the post-World War II era, veterans have just a whole bunch of money to be able to spend and spur on economic growth. His civil rights during his political career are going to be questionable. He will get elected making big promises to African Americans to help the civil rights movement, but he's going to be very slow to actually try and execute those promises. And it's not necessarily because he doesn't think civil rights are important, but you got to remember he's kind of got two different things he's got to worry about. One is domestic issues, right? Those are important, the civil rights movement, the economy. But then he's got foreign policy he's got to worry about, right? He's in the middle of the Cold War. During his time, we're going to have the, Bay of Pigs, which is going to be a gigantic failure for the United States. We're going to have the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're going to have the arms race that we're going to be dealing with. And so Kennedy really thinks that foreign policy outweighs domestic policy. And so he's kind of going to ignore the civil rights movement. He's going to view it as a distraction because in his mind, he's trying to keep the world from blowing itself up. And so, the civil rights leaders are going to be upset about that. They're going to think, you're the president. You should be able to chew gum and walk at the same time. I don't know that that's fair. a fair assessment, but I also don't know that it's not a fair assessment. And so, eventually we're going to see he will step in during, I mean, he's going to have to be, dragged into the civil rights movement, kicking and screaming during the freedom rides. Eventually he's going to have his brother, the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, step in and get the EOC to desegregate bus terminals. And then, later on, when we start to see the protests over segregation in Birmingham. The Kennedy administration is going to be watching. Remember SNCC, Project C from previous lectures, the Children's Crusade, where a bunch of kids go out on the street to protest segregation in Birmingham, and the police are beating them up live on television. Kennedy at that point is going to feel like he's got to step into the civil rights movement, and he's going to advocate for the 1964 Civil Rights Act. He won't get it passed, but that's because he's going to get killed. And so, it's really not until the end of his life that he really kind of starts to make good on some of the promises that he makes to African Americans so he can get elected. Now, you can't talk about the Kennedys without talking about kind of their image, and you can't talk about the Kennedy's image without talking about Jackie Kennedy. Jackie Kennedy comes from a wealthy, American family. She is, considered to, she's gorgeous. She's young. She's considered, in the elite social circles. She's just kind of idolized and is a fashion icon at the time. She's musical. She speaks fluent French. And she comes from old money. And the Kennedys, being always conscious of their image, they're incredibly wealthy, but a lot of the wealthy people in America kind of look down on them as new money. They call them the nouveau riche, right? Like newly rich. And it's like, they're not quite accepted into the elite social circles in America. And so Joe Kennedy really wants them to get to have a connection to that old money world. And so he really kind of arranges the marriage between John and Jackie. It's not an arranged marriage in the typical sense of an arranged marriage, but Joe puts a lot of pressure on John to marry Jackie and to kind of complete the image. And boy, does she, right? I mean, her marriage to John lends the Kennedy family and John F. Kennedy a lot of credibility in the necessary social circles. And the two of them are just like, gorgeous couple that are on the cover of all the different magazines, fashion magazines. All the men want to be John, all the women want to be Jackie. And so, they just become this like pop culture icon. Jackie later too is going to lend him some international credibility. The French in particular are going to love her because she speaks fluent French, and she dresses so well, and that come with all the accoutrements. Now, the marriage here is not a good marriage. John is stepping out on this marriage constantly. There's all kinds of stories and legends about John F. Kennedy and his affairs. Marilyn Monroe. Both he and his brother, allegedly have affairs with Marilyn Monroe. John F. Kennedy uses the Secret Service to kind of shuffle women in the back door of the White House for the affairs that he's having. The reality is that a guy like John F. Kennedy and the way that he behaved when it comes to women could never get elected today, right? The media really knew about all these affairs and the way that he treated women, which is absolutely horrible. His brother Edward Kennedy at Chappaquiddick is cheating on his wife at a party, and gets drunk at the party, leaves the party with his girlfriend, drives off a bridge. His girlfriend dies. He flees the scene, and tries to cover it all up. And it really, I mean, people find out about it, but it really didn't affect his political career. I mean, Edward Kennedy was a senator from Massachusetts all the way up until just recently when he died. And so, Robert Kennedy had an affair with Marilyn Monroe and treated her absolutely horribly. John F. Kennedy, right, all the affairs at the White House and things like that. I mean, you just that kind of behavior today just wouldn't be socially acceptable. But like I said, the media knew about a lot of this stuff. They covered it up. They felt like, well, that's his personal life, it has nothing to do with his ability to do his job. And so, the marriage isn't what it seems to be on the surface and in the media, but the average voter doesn't know that. They just see what they think is this like perfect couple, and it's going to appeal to a lot of people. So, John F. Kennedy will be running in the election of 1960 against Richard Nixon. So, Richard Nixon was a vice president for President Eisenhower. And so, during this election, it's really, and to be honest with you, Nixon, who's this totally immoral guy, we all know, like, the Nixon tapes and Watergate scandal. We'll talk about that in future lectures. But Nixon's a crook, but he's a really good politician. We know from the Checker speech in a previous lecture that he really kind of understands politics really well. He is an expert on foreign policy. I mean, he's going to later become president, be the guy that helps to open up China, normalize those relations. And so, it's really kind of viewed, this election is really kind of viewed as youthful energy versus like older experience. And so, Kennedy, Nixon tries to play Kennedy up as this, young, inexperienced guy, and Kennedy really plays up Nixon's age, and does it really well. As a matter of fact, when they have their first debate, Kennedy's really the first to understand the importance of television in the election, and so they have a debate, and it's a televised debate. And so, Kennedy goes in, and he knows that Nixon's a sweater, like sweats a lot, not like a sweater, but sweats a lot. And so Kennedy asks the producers to turn up the temperature. He says he's cold, and that's just a ploy. He wants the temperature turned up because he wants Nixon to be sweating. So this entire debate, Kennedy just looks cool and relaxed, and Nixon's constantly mopping the sweat off his face, and it makes him look just kind of like this old, incapable guy that doesn't have any energy and just makes him look gross. Whereas Kennedy is one of the first guys to recognize that, on TV, you've got to wear makeup, and, which Nixon refused to do. He thinks men just shouldn't do that. And so, Kennedy plays it really smart. And the interesting thing about that debate is, the people who listened to it on the radio, when they were polled, overwhelmingly said Nixon won the debate, right? But on TV, the people who watched it on TV, they overwhelmingly said that Kennedy won the debate. And so, really, what you have here is, radio, you only hear words and ideas. And so the majority of people who listened to it tended to agree with Nixon philosophically and with his ideas. The people who watched it on TV, well, they heard the ideas and saw the image. And so what that implies is that the people on TV decided with their eyes instead of with their ears. And so, fortunately for Kennedy, more people watched the debate than listened to the debate. And so Kennedy will become elected president. He's going to overcome a huge hurdle, which he's going to become the first Roman Catholic president. I think a lot of people listening to this right now are going to think, well, that's no big deal. Well, it actually is a pretty big deal. America's been pretty anti-Catholic for most of our history, and particularly with our politicians. There's an exception for the Irish community in the United States, but the idea is, you can't trust a Catholic because they're not going to be loyal to America. They're going to be loyal to the Pope. And so there's been a lot of anti Catholic sentiment, particularly in American politics. And Kennedy's going to be able to crush that. I mean, he is a devout Catholic and he doesn't necessarily hide it. He doesn't try to play it up or anything, but he is a Catholic and he's going to be able to get elected, and it's going to help us kind of move past that stereotype that Catholics are going to put the Pope ahead of their country. His entire campaign is based on what he kind of refers to as the new frontier. And so the new frontier, we'll talk about that a little bit later. He really, in his inauguration speech, he's going to give one of the more famous inauguration speeches where he says, the famous line, and I'm probably not getting it exactly right, but, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. And the idea is, hey, like it's not about what your government can do for you. It's that, we all have an obligation as citizens to try and put our country in the best position possible, because that's what's going to help everybody. And so he's going to ask for service and, things with like the AmeriCorps and, the space program and things like that. It's going to be really kind of an appealing thing. And again, like I said here, the televised debates are going to be very impactful in the election. It's Kennedy's going to do really well with the people who watch the debates, and particularly with women. So he wins the election. He doesn't win it huge. You can see this is the electoral map here. Let me get I'm going to cover up Alaska. Not that I think Alaska's not important. A little bit Alaska, a little bit Hawaii. But I want you to see here. Nixon is seen in red here, and the South, pretty solidly Democratic. Nixon is going to do fairly well when you take a look at the popular vote here. It's going to be close, 49.7% to 49.6%. Now, the Electoral College vote, a little bit more lopsided, but it is going to be relatively close here. One of the most important states in this election is going to end up being Illinois, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. My OCD tells me I have to move this back. All right, so how did Kennedy win? Well, like I said, the TV debates, he really uses TV well. He uses his image well. He's well-dressed. Obviously he's attractive, manipulates the situation to make Nixon look bad. His VP is going to be Johnson, who's LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who will become president after Kennedy is assassinated. He's a Texas Democrat. That is going to help Kennedy do well in the South. Anytime a Democrat can, have Texas in play, that's very good for the Democrat. So Johnson is going to help tremendously there and be very important later. He is going to get, a strong African American vote because of the promises that he makes during the civil rights movement. And remember, we talked about that. He makes a lot of promises and then kind of puts it on the back burner until the end of his life, when he recognizes he and his brother are going to have to get involved. He also does really well with women. During this election. But I mean, kind of, one of the most controversial parts about this election, I don't want to say the most important, but controversial, is what happens in Chicago with Mayor Daley. Mayor Daley is the mayor of Chicago. He's in charge of the Daley machine, which is one of the most powerful political machines in the country. Still to this day, the Chicago machine is incredibly powerful. And Daley will swing the vote in Chicago to Kennedy. Tons of accusations of corruption there, that the Kennedys, they're going to spend money to make this happen. There's going to be accusations of him buying the vote. There's going to be accusations that we do know that the mafia is actually going to, be impactful here. Now, whether or not there's direct coordination, I can't tell you about that. I just not an expert on that. But there's some shenanigans in Chicago that are going to swing Illinois to the Kennedy administration. And so, again, very impactful. And again, part of the drive that Joe Kennedy has to get his son elected. The indications are that JFK doesn't really necessarily know about the shenanigans in Chicago, that was more behind the scenes done by Joe Kennedy. And, not that JFK doesn't know that his dad is willing to do shady stuff to get him elected. I mean, he did shady stuff to get him in Harvard and get him through Harvard and whatnot. So the Kennedy administration, their agenda is called the New Frontier. And so, again, strong public position on civil rights, but slow to make good on those promises. He's going to, one of his weaknesses, one of the things that Richard Nixon did really well is to make Kennedy look soft on communism. The Nixon as a politician really became a national figure because of Alger Hiss. And so when, going after communist spies, the Pumpkin Papers that we talked about in the previous lecture on McCarthyism. And so Nixon knows he's, more of a foreign policy expert. And so really makes Kennedy look weak on foreign policy. And because of that, that's going to be important because Kennedy is very insecure about his foreign policy, and he knows he looks weak and he wants to look strong. So he's going to increase military spending. He is going to try and dial in the arms race. He's going to rely a little bit more on the CIA. He's going to want to talk to Khrushchev about, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, he's going to want to talk to Khrushchev about limiting nuclear weapons. That's going to blow up in his face because of the U-2 spy plane incident. We talked about that in a previous Cold War lecture as well. But, and ultimately, because he knows he looks weak, that will ultimately lead him into a huge mistake in the Bay of Pigs. He's going to be more aggressive than he should have been because he is afraid he has this image of looking weak. So increased spending on the military, but does want to use the CIA and special forces in lieu of necessarily just stockpiling massive amounts of nuclear weapons. So he's also going to make a big part of his administration aid to developing nations. This is an extension of the Truman Doctrine and this idea that if we're fighting a Cold War, one of the best ways to do that is to help foreign nations thrive economically. It's again the extension of Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan and all these previous Cold War philosophies, right? The Marshall Plan, the economic aid package to Europe. We know that the more economically thriving a country is, the less likely they are to want to be socialist or communist, right? I mean, the idea of redistributing wealth, if people have things, if they have a high standard of living, they don't want the government to come in and take those things from them and give them to other people. And so, the better off people are doing, the less likely they are to, feel like communism is a viable option. And so, we're going to see the Alliance for Progress be created to try and help a lot of these countries. The Alliance for Progress, we're going to be helping all kinds of different countries here, but we're going to focus a lot of it on Central and Southern America. So we're providing technical assistance. We're going to help them do all kinds of, infrastructure programs to help Latin America, try and build up their economy as much as possible. It's a 10-year, multi-billion-dollar deal. It's going to be, moderately successful. Latin America, because of our history with Latin America, is going to be kind of skeptical of this and of these policies. Like we've done some kind of shady stuff in Latin America, and so it's at least a good step in the right direction to kind of mend those fences. And again, used as a tool to try and limit the influence of communism. We're also going to see the creation of the Peace Corps. This is going to be a wildly successful program. Peace Corps is going to be very similar to the Alliance for Progress, except this is used kind of as an outreach program where we're going to send young Americans into these foreign countries to build schools and bridges and roads and wells. And so, just it's a goodwill program for struggling countries. And so we're going to send about 35,000 workers into about 60 different countries. And, it does multiple things. One, it's going to, help make America better by sending young people overseas to have this experience, to be more attached to the world at large, and help do good in the world. And it's also going to increase our image. Remember, when the Soviet Union and the communist and socialist countries are going into these other nations, they're going into economically exploit these nations for resources. America recognizes, like, we want to paint a very specific picture. We want them to be the bad guys, and we want us to be the good guys. Now, that's a gross oversimplification, because there's going to be times where America does look like the bad guys. I mean, we're going to set up a dictator in Iran, and there's going to be times where the Soviet Union doesn't necessarily look so bad. When we back out of the Aswan Dam project in Egypt, Soviet Union is going to step in and help with that. And so, it's a gross oversimplification to say that the Peace Corps makes us the good guys and the Soviet Union the bad guys. There are going to be exceptions there, but for the most part, right? The majority of the time, America really is at this point reaching out and trying to mend some fences. We are going to still be supporting some dictators specifically because they're not communist. And that's going to be bad. And that's going to happen a lot in Latin America. It's going to happen a lot in the Middle East, right? But for the most part, America is becoming the strongest force for good in the world because of organizations like the Peace Corps, the Alliance for Progress, extensions of the Marshall Plan, and whatnot. And so, we're really trying to target tyranny, poverty. We're trying to help with disease, trying to limit war, and all those things are, gonna really start to change the image of the United States, and really give us the image that we have today. There's lots of countries that still have problems with us today, but we are one of the biggest supporters of democracy and freedom around the world, probably the biggest. We are the country around the world that provides the most amount of aid to the world. We are a bulwark against poverty around the world, and one of the biggest supporters of freedom. So, Kennedy's domestic policy beliefs, he will believe in deficit spending. There's no doubt about it. He will increase Social Security and unemployment coverage. The Social Security, today it's one of the largest burdens on the debt and deficit. It is also one of the most important social programs we have. It's one of those things that's really scary. It's scary because we need it so much, because it's retirement insurance for old people, and we don't want old people, to not be able to pay their bills, eating cat food and not being able to keep the power on or afford their medicine. But also, it's one of those things that has put us now. It's so hard to even keep track of. I think, like, just a few months ago, I think we were 22, $23 trillion in debt. Now we're like 25, $26 trillion in debt. And, as far as that debt goes, the vast majority of it is Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And so, Craziness. But Kennedy is going to try to increase the number of people on those rolls. That will be deficit spending, right? Put us further in debt. He is going to raise minimum wage, and so he's going to increase the federal minimum wage. He's going to help a lot of low income workers. He is going to pass a housing act in '61, which is again is designed to provide low income housing, particularly for like urban poor communities, give them affordable housing, which is very important. Even today, one of the biggest discrepancies in the accumulated wealth between white families and African American families are housing. White families that have been able to accumulate wealth over time have been able to buy homes in neighborhoods where the houses appreciate in value, where they keep going up. Whereas what we see in African American neighborhoods, even the people that are able to afford houses, generally it's in neighborhoods where the house values don't rise over time, and so it's really hard to accumulate wealth in that situation. And so the federal housing acts try to help that situation. I'm not sure. I'm not an economist. I'm not sure how effective that has been, because we still see the same problem today. But at least it's an attempt, and I think that's important. And then $9 million of that's going to be held back for depressed urban areas, which are primarily, I shouldn't say primarily, are going to help African Americans and other minorities. Kennedy's also going to be very important in the space race. Remember, the Soviets are winning the space race. They're the first to launch a satellite that orbits the Earth, that Sputnik, that freaks America out. We start to realize maybe our education system's not as good as the Soviets. It is, it's better, but we don't know that because they launched a satellite and we did it. Later, we'll get Explorer up there. They're the first to put a man into space, Yuri Gagarin. They're the first to do a spacewalk, right, where somebody actually leaves the spaceship and like floats out in space. They're the first to, crash land something onto the moon. They're the first to soft land a space ship on the moon. And so Kennedy is going to recognize we're losing this PR battle, and he's going to make a very bold promise to be the first to land a man on the moon. That's very bold because we're losing this race, and it's going to require massive amounts of spending to be able to get somebody to the moon. But he makes the promise, and we do it, which is amazing. So he makes this commitment because it's important. Humanity is we are explorers. We've been exploring forever, and Kennedy thinks that space is the next the next area that humankind needs to expand. I think it's a little bit sad that we've lost that vision, today. Although we're starting to make, moves back into space today, but Kennedy really believes that if you want to energize America, and you do it through exploration, and space is the next place to go. All right. So keep in mind, we're losing that space race, but eventually, because of Kennedy's promise and his investment into the space race, we will be the first to land a man on the moon, Neil Armstrong. This is The space race is going to have a gigantic impact on American education. We are going to double down our efforts in science and math. You ask a kid growing up at this time period, what do you want to be when you grow up? They say, I want to be an astronaut. Right? And so that means they're going into science, they're going into math, they're going into engineering, right? Those things are what kids want to learn, right? Not just being forced. They want to learn those things. Ask a kid today. I think the latest articles that I've read on the subject matter is that kids, when asked, their number one career choice is YouTuber. Man, hey, great. I mean, your generation has figured out how to monetize YouTube. I mean, I actually do think that is amazing. I don't know how great it is for society, though. Much better to be an engineer, scientist, something like that. But what do I know? I'm going to put this video on YouTube, so hypocrite, right? Uh, more emphasis on science, technology, math, etc. All right. That concludes today's introduction into the Kennedy administration. The next lecture, we're going to pick up and talk about Kennedy and his foreign policy. There's some doozies in that one. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time and have a wonderful day.